Here is the most insane thing about World War I. Nobody wanted it. Not really, not the way you'd think. The war that killed 17 million people, destroyed 4 empires, redrew the map of the entire world, and directly caused an even bigger war 20 years later. That war was started almost entirely by accident, by a series of decisions made by people who thought they were calling each other's bluffs. It started with one gunshot. One, a 19-year-old with a pistol and terrible aim who almost missed his target entirely, got a second chance through a navigational error that nobody planned, and fired 2 shots that somehow managed to kill not just an archduke, but an entire world order that had existed for centuries. 37 days later, the 6 most powerful nations in Europe were at war with each other. 17 million people would be dead before it was over. And when it finally ended, after 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, the peace treaty was so badly designed, so humiliating, so economically catastrophic for the losing side, that it functioned less as an ending and more as a timer. Set to 20 years, World War I didn't just kill 17 million people. It loaded the gun for World War II, and it all started because a driver took a wrong turn. But before we get into the wrong turn, the assassination, the avalanche of bad decisions, the trenches, the gas attacks, the Christmas truce, and the peace treaty that made everything worse. Welcome to Sketchy Past. Fast history, zero fluff, maximum chaos. Subscribe right now, ring the bell, and join the Sketchy Empire. We've been building toward this one since the beginning. This is the war that broke the modern world. Let's figure out how. Let's go. To understand how World War I happened, you need to understand the world that produced it. Because 1914 Europe was not a place that looked like it was about to explode. It looked, to most people living in it, like the most stable and prosperous continent in human history. Europe in 1914 was rich. Industrialization had transformed living standards across the continent over the previous century. Railways connected cities that had been days apart by horse. Telegraphs moved information at the speed of electricity. Trade between European nations was at historic highs. The middle class was growing. Technology was advancing at a pace that felt genuinely miraculous to people living through it. European powers also controlled most of the world. Britain's empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. France controlled huge swaths of Africa and Southeast Asia. Germany, the newest major power, was building its colonial presence aggressively, and its industrial output was growing fast enough to alarm its neighbors. On the surface, prosperity, progress, and a continent that had not seen a major general European war since Napoleon 100 years earlier. Under the surface, a system of interlocking alliances, military build-ups, colonial rivalries, and nationalist tensions that was almost perfectly designed to turn a local crisis into a continental catastrophe. The alliance system was the critical structural problem. Europe had divided itself into 2 armed camps. On one side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. France and Russia were formal allies. Britain had informal understandings with both. On the other side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Germany and Austria, Hungary were tightly bound. Italy was nominally allied, but would prove less committed when it actually mattered. The logic of alliances is supposed to be deterrence. If you attack one of us, you attack all of us, so don't attack any of us. The problem with this logic is that it works perfectly until it doesn't. If deterrence fails, if someone calls the bluff, or misjudges the situation, or decides that war is preferable to backing down, the alliance system doesn't prevent a war. It guarantees that a local conflict immediately becomes a continental one. European military planners were also operating with timetables that made crisis management almost impossible. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's war strategy, required Germany to knock out France within 6 weeks through Belgium, then turn east to face Russia before the Russians could fully mobilize. This plan required mobilization to begin immediately at the first sign of crisis, because any delay would throw off the entire timetable. Once Germany started mobilizing, France had to mobilize. Once France mobilized, Britain's treaty obligations kicked in. Once Austria-Hungary mobilized against Russia, Russia had to respond. The alliance system and the military timetables together created a situation where, once a crisis began, The pressure to escalate was enormous, and the pressure to stop was almost non-existent. Add to this nationalism. The 19th century had produced powerful nationalist movements across Europe. The idea that peoples sharing a language and culture should have their own states. This was a destabilizing force in the multi-ethnic empires, particularly Austria, Hungary, which ruled over Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, and a dozen other nationalities who all had opinions about self-determination. The Balkans, the region covering modern-day Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and surrounding areas, was the most volatile pressure point, where Serbian nationalism was directly threatening Austria-Hungarian imperial authority. And finally, military culture. The generals and strategists of 1914 were, almost universally, operating with a theory of warfare that was catastrophically out of date. The wars they had studied, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the American Civil War, had suggested that offensive action won wars quickly. Charge hard, break the enemy, win fast. What they hadn't adequately absorbed was that the technology of 1914 machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, industrial production of ammunition, massively favored defense over offense. You could dig a trench and hold it against forces 10 times your number. Charging across open ground against a defended position with machine guns was not a military tactic. It was a massacre. Nobody in charge in 1914 fully understood this yet. The 28th of June 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Sarajevo on a state visit. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria, Hungary in 1908, and the visit was politically significant. A display of imperial authority in a region where Serbian nationalism was running high. A group of young Bosnian, Serb nationalists, connected to a secret Serbian nationalist organization called the Black Hand, had assembled in Sarajevo with the intention of killing Franz Ferdinand. There were 6 of them, positioned along the route of the Archduke's motorcade. The first assassination attempt, earlier in the day, failed. One of the conspirators threw a bomb at Franz Ferdinand's car. The bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the following car, injuring several people. Franz Ferdinand's car accelerated away. The conspirators scattered. The assassination had failed. Franz Ferdinand continued to the town hall for his scheduled reception. And here is where the wrong turn changes history. After the town hall reception, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit the people who had been injured in the bomb explosion at the hospital. His motorcade set off on a different route than originally planned. The lead driver, apparently not informed of the route change, turned onto a street called Franz Josef Street, the original planned route by mistake. The Archduke's aide, de Camp, called out that the driver was going the wrong way. The driver stopped the car to turn around. The car stopped directly in front of a delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip, one of the failed conspirators, who had given up on the assassination and stopped for a sandwich, was standing on the pavement. Princip was 19 years old. He was 5 feet 2 inches tall. He had tuberculosis and had been rejected by the Serbian army for being too small and too sick. He was an extremely unlikely assassin. He was standing 2 feet from the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He pulled out his pistol and fired twice. The first shot hit Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. The second hit his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both died within the hour. Princip was grabbed by the crowd immediately. He tried to swallow a cyanide capsule. It didn't work. He tried to shoot himself. The gun was taken. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was too young for the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law. He died of tuberculosis in prison in 1918, 4 years into his sentence, and 4 years into the war his action had started. The driver had taken a wrong turn. Princip had stopped for a sandwich. A car had stalled in front of a delicatessen, and 17 million people were going to die as a result. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not automatically cause World War I. What caused World War I was the 37 days of diplomatic crisis that followed, in which every major power made a series of decisions that were individually understandable and collectively catastrophic. Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination. The assassins had connections to Serbian nationalist groups, and the Austro-Hungarian government decided this was an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. They sent Serbia an ultimatum with 10 demands, deliberately designed to be humiliating enough that Serbia would have to refuse at least some of them, giving Austria-Hungary a pretext for military action. Serbia accepted 9 of the 10 demands. The one they rejected, allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in the investigation on Serbian soil, was a matter of sovereignty they couldn't concede without effectively surrendering their independence. Austria-Hungary declared it insufficient and declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July, 1914, 30 days after the assassination. Russia, which considered itself the protector of Slavic peoples and had strategic interests in the Balkans, began mobilizing in support of Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary and alarmed by Russian mobilization, demanded Russia stop. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August. France, allied with Russia, began mobilizing. Germany declared war on France on the 3rd of August. Germany implemented the Schlieffen Plan, invading neutral Belgium to outflank French defenses. Britain, which had a treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on the 4th of August. 37 days after 2 gunshots in Sarajevo, the 6 most powerful nations in Europe were at war. The populations of most countries greeted the war with something that looks, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible: enthusiasm. Crowds cheered in the streets of Paris, Berlin, London, and Vienna. Young men rushed to enlist before the war ended, because everyone assumed it would be over by Christmas. A short, sharp, decisive war, like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. A few battles, a quick victory, home by the holidays. Military planners on both sides had timetables. Germany needed to knock out France in 6 weeks. Everyone expected movement, decision, resolution. What they got instead was the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan failed. German forces swept through Belgium and into France, advancing rapidly in the opening weeks. Then were stopped at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. French and British forces managed to halt the German advance just short of Paris. Both sides then did the same thing simultaneously. They dug in. Within weeks of the Marne, both armies had begun constructing defensive positions, trenches, at first improvised and temporary, then increasingly elaborate and permanent. Each side tried to outflank the other's line, and each time one side extended its trenches, the other matched it. By late 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the English Channel coast in Belgium all the way to the Swiss border, roughly 475 miles. This was the Western Front, and it barely moved for 4 years. The trenches themselves were not simple ditches. On both sides, they developed into elaborate underground systems: front-line trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, connected by communication trenches, reinforced with sandbags and timber, equipped with dugouts that provided some protection from artillery. The German trenches were generally better constructed than the Allied ones. The Germans were on the defensive and invested in permanence. The British and French theoretically intended to advance and didn't want to look too comfortable. Life in the trenches was a combination of grinding misery and sudden violent death. Soldiers lived with mud, rats, lice, the constant smell of decay, because the area between the opposing trenches, no man's land, was littered with bodies that couldn't be recovered under fire. Shell shock, what we would now recognize as PTSD, was epidemic, but poorly understood and often treated as cowardice. Trench foot, caused by standing in cold water for extended periods, was a constant medical problem. Artillery dominated the battlefield. Both sides had invested massively in industrial-scale artillery production, and the guns fired almost continuously. A major offensive would begin with artillery bombardments lasting days or weeks, firing millions of shells into the enemy's lines, intended to destroy the barbed wire, collapse the trenches, and kill the defenders before the infantry went over the top. It rarely worked the way it was supposed to. The bombardment gave away exactly where and when the attack was coming. German defenders would shelter in deep dugouts during the bombardment, then emerge when it stopped and man their machine guns before the advancing infantry could cross no man's land. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 is the single darkest day in British military history. On the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the offensive, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead, in one day. After a week-long artillery bombardment that was supposed to have destroyed the German defences, the German machine gunners emerged from their dugouts, set up their weapons, and cut down advancing British soldiers at a rate that military historians still struggle to describe without running out of words. The Battle of the Somme lasted until November 1916, total casualties on all sides, over 1 million. Territory gained by the British, roughly 6 miles Verdun, fought simultaneously in 1916, was even more brutal in terms of total casualties, somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 French and German soldiers, killed or wounded over 10 months of fighting over an area that could be crossed by car in 20 minutes. Both battles were attempts to break the stalemate. Neither worked. The Western Front barely moved. Chemical weapons were introduced to try to break the deadlock. Chlorine gas, first used by the Germans at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, created a new dimension of horror. Phosgene and mustard gas followed. Soldiers who survived a gas attack often did so with permanently damaged lungs, blindness, or disfiguring burns. Gas masks became standard equipment. The introduction of chemical weapons to modern warfare is one of the legacies of World War I that humanity is still living with. In the middle of all this horror, something happened in December 1914 that remains one of the most remarkable moments in military history. The Christmas truce, along sections of the Western Front on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, 1914, soldiers on both sides, German and British, sometimes French, spontaneously stopped fighting. It started with German soldiers placing candles and small Christmas trees on the parapets of their trenches. British soldiers saw the lights and held their fire. Germans began singing Christmas carols. British soldiers responded with their own. And then, along various sections of the line, soldiers climbed out of their trenches, walked into no man's land, and met the enemy face to face. They exchanged cigarettes, food, and souvenirs. They showed each other photographs of their families. In some places, they organized informal football matches in no man's land. For a few hours on Christmas Day, 1914, ordinary men who had been trying to kill each other decided not to. The truce was unofficial, unauthorized, and deeply alarming to the high commands on both sides, who gave strict orders that it was not to be repeated. In 1915 and subsequent years, orders were given to maintain active operations on Christmas specifically to prevent any repeat. The Christmas truce is often presented as a heartwarming story. It is also an indictment of the system that put those men in those trenches in the first place, and of the commanders who immediately worked to ensure it could never happen again. The war ground on. By 1917, the strain on all sides was becoming critical. Russia collapsed from within. The February Revolution of 1917 overthrew the Tsar, and the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. Russia signed the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, exiting the war and freeing up German forces for a final push on the Western Front. The United States entered the war in April 1917, pushed finally by Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which was sinking American ships, and by the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany secretly proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States in exchange for helping Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When British intelligence intercepted and published the telegram, American public opinion shifted decisively. Fresh American troops, the Doughboys, began arriving in France in large numbers through 1917 and 1918, providing the manpower infusion the Allies desperately needed. Germany's spring offensive of 1918, a massive final push using troops freed from the Eastern Front, made significant gains but ultimately failed to break through. The Allies counterattacked in August 1918 in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive, a continuous series of attacks that pushed the Germans back, city by city, week by week. The German military situation became untenable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in October 1918. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice. Bulgaria surrendered. Germany's allies were gone. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on the 9th of November, 1918. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice came into effect. The guns stopped. Soldiers on both sides reportedly stood in silence, not knowing what to do. 4 years of constant noise, and then nothing. The war was over. 17 million people were dead. The peace conference that followed, held at Versailles outside Paris in 1919, was supposed to create a stable, lasting post-war order. The American President Woodrow Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a framework for peace based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations to resolve future disputes without war. What actually emerged from Versailles was shaped by French and British demands for punishment and compensation. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, imposed the following on Germany. Germany had to accept sole responsibility for the war guilt clause, Article 231. Germany had to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, a sum so enormous it wasn't fully paid off until 2010. Germany lost roughly 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Germany's military was limited to 100,000 men with no air force and a minimal navy. German colonies were distributed among the Allied powers. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the conference as part of the British delegation, resigned in protest and published a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he predicted, with extraordinary accuracy, that the treaty's terms would destabilize Germany economically, produce political extremism, and lead to another war. He was right about all of it. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government that replaced the Kaiser, was saddled with war guilt, reparations, and territorial losses that its political opponents used relentlessly to undermine public faith in democracy. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s wiped out German savings. The Great Depression of the 1930s devastated the economy again. Into this political and economic catastrophe stepped a failed Austrian painter and decorated WW1 corporal, who blamed Germany's humiliation on internal enemies, promised to restore German greatness, and built a political movement on the resentment that Versailles had created. His name was Adolf Hitler. The Treaty of Versailles didn't cause World War II by itself, but it created the conditions, the economic desperation, the political humiliation, the nationalist resentment, that made a demagogue like Hitler possible. The peace conference that was supposed to end war created the preconditions for the deadliest conflict in human history. World War I killed 17 million people. World War II, the war it made possible, killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million. One wrong turn, 2 gunshots, 37 days of bad decisions, and the world that existed before the 28th of June, 1914, never came back. The 4 empires that had dominated European politics for centuries, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, were all gone by 1918. The map of Europe was completely redrawn. The confidence in human progress and civilization that had characterized the pre-war period was shattered. The literature, art, and philosophy of the 1920s, the lost generation, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, the Dadists, was the cultural output of people who had seen the optimism of the 19th century get fed into a machine gun and come out the other side as mud and wire and bones in no man's land. The world before 1914 was gone. What replaced it was harder, more cynical, more violent, and carrying wounds that would take generations to heal. Some historians argue they're still healing. That was World War I, the war nobody wanted, that 17 million people died in anyway, started by a wrong turn and 2 gunshots, sustained by 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter in trenches that barely moved, and ended by a peace treaty so badly designed that it functioned as a timer for the next war. If this hit you differently than you expected, if you came in thinking you knew the basics and left realizing how deep this rabbit hole goes, like this video right now, every like tells the algorithm this channel is worth pushing to more people. Subscribe to Sketchy Past if you haven't already. Ring the bell. We are building a series here. Caesar, Attila, Alexander, the Mongols, Napoleon, and now WW1. And each video connects to the next in ways that make the whole thing bigger than any single episode. Next episode, World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, 70 to 85 million dead. A war fought on 6 continents, under the sea, and eventually above the atmosphere. A war that produced both the Holocaust and the liberation of Europe, the atomic bomb and the Marshall Plan, the worst of what humanity is capable of, and some of the best. And it all started in a very direct line, from a wrong turn in Sarajevo in 1914. See you in the next one.